Well, welcome to this webinar, the 11th, staged by a project being conducted by Adam Czarnota, Wojciech Sadurski, and me, Martin Krieger, on populism and constitutional democracy. The project is supported by the Australian Research Council, and in these webinars, held in cooperation with the Central European University's Democracy Institute in Budapest, we discuss the most recent and important books dealing with contemporary populism around the world with their authors. They're recorded and they're archived, and you can access any of them through the project's website, globalconpop.blog. Globalconpop is all one word, or on YouTube. And you'll be notified when this one is edited and appears online. Today's webinar differs from our usual fare in two interconnected ways. First, one regular member of our panel, Wojciech Sadurski, is missing from it, and that's because his most recent book, A Pandemic of Populists, is the subject of the seminar. We felt that even he would find it difficult, though perhaps not impossible, to subject himself to the sort of merciless cross-examination we expect. So we eliminated him from that role to enable us to prosecute, perhaps persecute, him in the other role. And that liberated us to invite another distinguished panelist who has appeared with us once before, Paula Cebulak, who is Assistant Professor in European Law at the University of Amsterdam, and from January will be at the Free University of Amsterdam. Paula joins us from Amsterdam. The rest of the panel is as usual, Adam Czarnota, but as was not usual, he is now in a new role as Rector of the Graduate School of Law at the University of Riga, Latvia, and he joins us from there. I'm Martin Krieger, I'm here in Sydney, and Wojciech also joins us from Sydney. One more thing I should mention is that our next webinar will be on November the 23rd at the unusual hour for us of 8 a.m. to fit in with East Coast United States time, where we'll be discussing with the authors Gene Cohen and Andrew Arato their recent book, Populism and Civil Society. Now let's turn to today's session and today's author and book. As many of you will know, Wojciech Sadurski is Challis Professor of Jurisprudence at the University of Sydney, as well as Professor in the Centre for Europe in the University of Warsaw. He's also a former member and head of the Department of Law at the European University Institute Florence. He's been visiting professor at countless universities around the world. In the United States, each year he contrives to find teaching at Yale, NYU, and other law schools on the East Coast, and he is well known in universities everywhere. He's a distinguished comparative constitutional lawyer, legal and political philosopher. He's a remarkably prolific author for both specialist and public audiences, and he is a gifted political journalist. In this year alone, rather extravagantly, he will have published 4 major books. One, Anti-Constitutional Populism, co-edited with Adam and me, published by Cambridge University Press. A work of political and legal philosophy, Constitutional Public Reason, published by Oxford University Press. The book we will shortly be discussing, A Pandemic of Populists, also by Cambridge. And a book of essays in Polish, Demokracja na czarną godzinę, Democracy for Dark Times or for a Dark Hour, published by Osteria Press in Kraków, Poland. He tells me, I've yet to see that book, but Wojciech tells me it's about everything, or at least everything Polish. 4, Wojciech is also an engaged participant observer in the politics of one of the regimes we're bound to be discussing tonight, that of Poland. He's a tweeter par excellence with, at last count, 64.9 thousand followers. And among other things, he has successfully defended himself against 3 suits brought against him by the Polish ruling party, quaintly named Law and Justice, and its wholly controlled, taxpayer-funded television media, TVP. The latest salvo in this artillery barrage against him is a technical appeal against the verdict of his last criminal defamation case, and that is to be heard on December the 6th. This prolonged litigation, incidentally, is an example of a phenomenon which is discussed in literature on populism and is discussed briefly in the book that we'll be discussing tonight, known among analysts as SLAP, double P, strategic lawsuits against public participation. On this, Wojciech is an expert. So all these talents and experiences are put to use in the book that we will discuss today. A Pandemic of Populists, apart from its handsome cover, I think I'm in blur, so it won't help you, and its inspired title, is an enticing read. It's full of clever argument, as you'd expect, but it's also full of information, rich in description of the activities of populist parties from many parts of the world, including India, Philippines, Latin America, Turkey, and of course, Central Europe. Wojciech doesn't pretend that all populist regimes are the same, but he discusses many of the central features that contemporary populist regimes have in common. He analyzes why they appear, how they behave, what their consequences are, and how we should appraise and respond to them. And though it's a book by an academic, it's not an academic book in the sense that makes us scowl, a book for specialists. Rather, it's written out for an audience of intelligent people who might be interested in the subject, not down for people assumed to need learned instruction. It's witty, smart, and pungent, and it's bound to be controversial. Okay, so there's the ad. Now let's get down to business. You're a busy guy, Wojciech, so why this book and why now?
Well, before I answer, first of all, my very big thanks to all four of you, that is Martin, Adam, Paula, and Caroline. And also let me just mention that when Martin said that there is this inspired title, then it is inspired in a very strong sense. I was inspired by Martin. In fact, he has not merely inspired me, but he has crafted this title for me. So thank you, Martin. I don't know whether I have to share royalties with you because there is still this very gifted designer of the book, a young, talented Italian painter, Giorgio De Chirico, who has produced this nice cover, especially for that book. So probably I will have to share with him too. Why today? Why now this book? Well, as usual, probably books that we write or articles that we write or anything that we write is determined by at least two types of factors which need to resonate with each other. Sort of a more quote unquote objective academic reasons, which have to do with the developments out there in the world, and sort of more autobiographical reasons, something that is specific to the person who decides to write her or his book or article. And these two things resonated in me in the following way. On the one hand, I saw that the issues which I had discussed in my previous book, Poland's Constitutional Breakdown, are really a case study of a much broader phenomenon in the world, and that is the emergence of authoritarian populist regimes, as I understand them. That is the regimes which originate from genuinely fair and free elections, and which in the course of their first term of office, sometimes second term of office, once they consolidate, they do attack the major institutions and often produce permanent changes to the worse to those institutions, while, and that would be the authoritarian part in the aggregate of authoritarian populism, while at the same time always trying to maintain strong support, if not by a majority, then at least by a strong plurality in the society, by various measures or by various devices, which I discuss in my book. So I just felt that this is a natural follow-up to or segue to my previous work, and that there is a real need to look at this worrying phenomenon of authoritarian populism.
So if somebody wanted to ask you what are the central characteristics, what is it which distinguishes populists from other regimes, from democracies, because after all, say that they're elected and elections matter to them, how would you tell them in a short
I would tell them that they fundamentally lack two essential ingredients of constitutional democracy. One is separation of powers, or any type of dispersion of powers, which can be at least defined in a negative way by the fact that it is not the case that all power is held by one person or one institution. And the second is the rule of law. That is an idea that there are some things which politicians cannot do, much as they would like to do it, because the law tells them not to, and it is not so easy, and also the political and legal culture prohibits them from changing the law whenever it would suit them. So these are the two fundamental differences between populist authoritarianism or populist states and democratic states, while they at the same time differ from, if you like, good old traditional repressive or despotic governments, in the sense, first of all, that they have genuine democratic sort of electoral legitimacy, and they care about it, and they often, at least until the second term of office, more or less maintain it. Sure, they skew the playing field in many ways, but this legitimacy is there. Secondly, that there is a relatively low, even very low level of violence, state violence, oppression and repression. That is why, for me, I haven't included Turkey in my list of exemplars of populist authoritarianism, because I think that they, just like Belarus, just like Venezuela under Maduro, they crossed certain lines. So they do not need, often, perhaps even, we can give them the benefit of doubt, want to apply a very high degree of coercion towards its opponents.
Okay, just as there is a big literature on populism with that in its title, there's a big literature on illiberalism with that in its title. And I know that Paula had been interested in some of the, I guess, conceptual distinctions between those terms and why one would choose one rather than another. So I'll ask her if she could step in and ask you about that.
Yes, this was actually indeed because you distinguish also in the book indeed well with the step towards regimes becoming authoritarian, but often in the academic debates, at least between the concept of illiberalism has also been coming back a lot in terms of describing the ideology of this democratic decay nowadays, and not only in the academic literature, but it has even been used by Viktor Orban himself famously. And there I was wondering, because I think often the definitions are a little bit more focusing like populism in terms of a technology, and that's also a definition that you distance yourself from by Kasmude and many others. And often it's actually the illiberalism that is more the ideological universe of this, that it's more sort of substantively loaded in the debates. And that often is also associated with the backlash against liberalism and all that came with it, all the scripts of liberalism, whether the economic script or the cultural scripts and the political ones, the proposing some majoritarian sovereigntist nationalist solutions, and also shifting kind of from politics more to culture in terms of the discourse. That's how, like, for instance, Marlène Laruelle would define the liberalism. And I thought that also could resonate with a lot of your narratives of describing those populist regimes, whether it's and especially also the focus on exceptional times of the pandemic. That's also something that many of the thinkers that were categorized as illiberal, whether Carl Schmitt or Lemaitre, have also been dealing with in there. So I was just curious also how you would distinguish that from writing about illiberalism.
Okay, I do not think that illiberalism is the main defining feature of those governments which I have in mind. So first of all, let me say to the participants who have not necessarily read the book that I am really interested in populists in power. So I'm not interested in populists when they fight for power, when they are close to power, like Marine Le Pen. Secondly, I'm interested in populists in power who have managed to dismantle the institutions, fundamental institutions. That is why I'm not necessarily interested in those populists in power like Donald Trump or Netanyahu or I don't know, Babiš in Czech Republic. They are all have many characteristics of populists, but they more, or Boris Johnson, or they manage to somehow accommodate themselves in the institutions as they are. So my concern is mainly institutional. And that is why I do not consider, Paula, your proposed idea that illiberalism may be their defining feature, because it doesn't have to be. I mean, the governments which I have in mind are sometimes quite liberal in terms of their economic policies. And especially, they are also quite liberal in the sense that they respect, by and large, many civil and political rights which are dear to liberals. I'm thinking about Poland. I mean, I'm not, no one can accuse me of being an apologist for Polish government, but I do not think that its assault on individual liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of political parties, assembly, etc., is huge. Yes, there have been some pretty terrible things done, for example, regarding surveillance of individuals, etc., but really not that qualitatively different from what we see in many unimpeachably democratic liberal states. But what does characterize them, to my view, are these two things. The very cavalier approach to the rule of law, that is, they basically use legal changes as a way of policy. And if the constitution doesn't allow them to do it, they just don't care. So they have purely instrumental approach to law, and therefore they violate the fundamental principle of the rule of law, that law must, to some extent at least, control politics rather than vice versa. And secondly, and most importantly, they cannot live with any degree of separation of powers or dispersion of powers or division of powers. And they do accumulate their power relentlessly, whether we are talking about Kaczynski or Orban or Modi or Bolsonaro or Duterte or Chavez until his death in 2012, I think. So these are the characteristic features in my view, and that is why liberalism does not necessarily capture this fundamental issue, because it is sort of like under-inclusive, you know. I mean, there are some populist authoritarian governments which are not horribly illiberal. And finally, I don't like all that much this concept of illiberalism, because in the literature, of course, and in the discourse, it often comes in a package of illiberal democracy, and I don't like this concept, because illiberal democracy sort of suggests that, okay, maybe it's illiberal, but it's democratic. And for reasons I just mentioned, I think it's not.
Can I follow up with, sorry, it was Adam, were you going to say something?
Yeah, just drop into this interesting discussion. Wojciech, could you elaborate about the relation of that, what you describe in the book, to the democracy precisely? Because you used two concepts now. On the very beginning, you mentioned, well, they meet some legitimacy criteria, election criteria, which means when we discuss with Adam Przeworski, they met these regimes, populist regimes, they met criteria of the minimum concept of democracy, right? Now you said that you use another liberal constitutional democracy. So I need some sort of the clarification. What do you mean by this relation of this regime to democracy?
So my concept of democracy is slightly broader than that of Professor Przeworski. Przeworski is famous for saying that democracy is a system in which parties lose elections, full stop. Okay? And therefore, rotation or alternation in power is the best evidence of democracy. And I may sort of agree to that, but I believe that in order for this condition of Przeworski to be met under this minimalist conception of democracy, we need really to have at least 4 main ingredients of democracy. One is free and fair elections, and the government sort of emerging from free and fair elections. That's the first thing. The second thing is, by and large, protection and respect for civil and political rights, which sort of seems to be almost subsumed by the first concept, because you cannot have free and fair elections in which you don't have freedom of press, speech, assembly, associations, etc. Third one is the rule of law, in the sense that the law stabilizes politics. In other words, you cannot have law changed whenever it suits you for your direct terms. Of course, it's a quantitative concept, because we know that the law must be changed, but we know when we see it that it is not respected. If Polish government has, over 2017, introduced some 7 or 8 changes to its legislative package on courts, then we see something is wrong there. Okay, they don't feel they are constrained at all, and I think it's not democratic if we don't have these rules of the game to be sort of stabilized. And finally, but perhaps most importantly, is the dispersion of power, and that does not clearly come under Przeworski's very minimalist conception, because theoretically you probably can have alternation in power, where, you know, whenever whoever wins the election wins everything. Winner takes all, but then subjects themselves to the next election. But I don't think you can talk about democracy if you don't have judicial independence, if the legislative institutions are at least to some extent independent of the executive, when you have respect for several autonomous or at least, you know, allegedly autonomous institutions, such as central bank, constitutional courts, various media boards, etc., which are meant there to be independent of the day-to-day politics. And of course, things like audit, the top audit bodies. So I think that my definition of democracy is still relatively minimalistic. I stay out of, say, issues of socioeconomic policy and social justice, which I admire, but I think that it goes beyond the definition of democracy, but it's not as minimal as Przeworski's is.
Can I mean, you're hinting and moving around something which is a central part of your argument, and it's the title of your second chapter. You talk about, the title is The War on Institutions, and it is a war as you describe it, but it's a very distinctive sort of war. So I wonder if you could say a little about why you call it a war, and then something about what makes it a very strange war. If we think of Putin waging a war, at least we know what we're talking about. But this is a very different sort of thing, even domestically, from what we've been used to when powerful regimes wage war against institutions in their country.
Yeah, so I think that they do wage war on the institutions of their countries, but the war is often almost invisible, almost by stealth, because they do maintain the inherited institutions, those institutions inherited from previous regime. And you, Martin, wrote about it quite eloquently, especially when interpreting your intellectual guru, Philip Selznick, that institutions are not just the matter of formal structure, this we may call simply organization, but also certain values which are entrenched in those institutions and were conveyed from one generation to another. People changed by the institutions stay because they maintain certain values. But populists don't preserve those values. They pick up the institutions, so they don't want to be seen from the outside as being Bolshevik revolutionaries. We come to power and we abolish the parliament or the courts, etc., and we introduce our new setting. No, it all seems from the outside that it's business as usual, but it's not, because they do erode the institutions from the inside. We often talk in our industry about hollowing out of the institutions. And I try to suggest in my book a certain taxonomy of various ways in which those institutions are being hollowed out, which mean they are being eroded of their raison d'etre, of the reason why they are there in the first place. So they take constitutional courts, they capture them by court packing, or by changing their procedures, or by changing their competencies, as is the case in Hungary and Poland. And then those institutions which initially have been, at least in a modest way, supposed to be counter-majoritarian, that is to be a check on majoritarian institutions, start performing the opposite role to the original one, and that is they do actually actively support the executive and the government. It's not that they become facade. It's worse than that. It wouldn't be as dangerous if they were merely facade, but they actually are active enablers of the government by reducing political costs of many of their decisions. But capture is just one possible way of eroding the meaning of the institutions. They do many other things. They create parallel institutions to the existing one, which overshadow the constitutional institutions, such as a new media board in Poland, or new regional and local structures in Hungary. They create, they erode the institutions of their competences or of the budget. They pick up the institutions and, quote unquote, migrate them to a different setting, just as Orban did with ombudsman in plural, or as Ziobro did in Poland with the prosecutor's office, which became part of the Ministry of Justice, etc. So there is the whole toolkit of picking up the institutions which they inherit. From the outside, it seems that nothing has changed, but in fact, everything has changed.
Paula, I mean, one context in which we would look to see if these phenomena and these activities are happening is, of course, that of the last few years and the pandemic. And I know that this is an interest that Paula has had. So perhaps you would like to ask about what that tells us about what we've been hearing.
But maybe before we come to the pandemic, I would actually want to ask about the institutions and the war on the institutions, because I mean, the classic kind of counter-majoritarian institutions are also courts, to which you devote also a chapter in the book. And there I was wondering to what extent is the capture happening in this kind of traditional ways of just repopulating and having the neo-judges, the pseudo-judges, different people being appointed there. So in the ways that we could say, even in some more kind of realist ways of just changing in a way the people there. But to what extent is more of a change in the ideas that is a lot more kind of deeply rooted? Because there is also now quite some research, amongst others by Anya Bernstein, on judicial populism, where they study this in the United States as a type of discourse that also permeates judicial decision-making. And this idea of us versus them, representing the real people, having this kind of majoritarian narratives, whether it comes I don't know, in the US, it can be about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter type of discourses. But in Europe, for instance, often issues of law and order can be one of the areas where we see that it's not about the personal preferences of judges. It's not only about those judges that are kind of appointed and completely enablers of the current regime, but even judges that are independent would still adopt the type of discourse that they would not go back on many of the sort of law and order measures in terms of criminal law or things like this, because these things have permeated also the public debates and the legal order and the legal culture in a way so much. So I wonder whether that's also something to take into account, not only to say that populist judges are those neo-judges that are illegitimate, but that we have certain ideas that have permeated our legal culture that will be a lot more difficult to sort of pull out of there, not only by replacing certain people, but that this cannot be done that easily in a way.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And that suggests to me that one should resist a temptation of thinking about relationship between judges and the populist governments as a one-way street. There is this bad populist government which tries to suppress, coerce, and bring into submission good, honest, independent judges. That's obviously not that simple, and the concept of judicial populism, which you mentioned, is visible in a number of countries around the world. I do not know the literature which you had mentioned, but I had read a very good piece by my Israeli friend Alon Harel, who is professor at University of Jerusalem, with a co-author whose name I forgot, about judicial populism in Israel under Netanyahu, but it was partly independent of Netanyahu himself. There were judges who said, look, we cannot stay, I'm now paraphrasing, in this ivory tower. We need to go out there, listen in the street to what people are saying, and then translate these genuine, unfiltered views of people into the law. Now we lawyers know why it is so wrong in so many ways. And the judicial legitimacy has nothing to do, that type of accountability and sort of translation of the raw views straight into their judgment. So yes, there are judges who behave like this, and that is also part of populism. And there are judges also who are simply want to be let alone, who stay low. This is a phenomenon which is well described, for example, by Sam Issacharoff, who wrote about judges in India, in the Indian Supreme Court, under the emergency of Indira Gandhi. We see it certainly very dramatically in Hungary, where there have been quite a number of accounts of behavior of judges there, including by Amnesty International, based on a large sample of interviews with judges. And the report, of course, was quoted them anonymously, who basically want to be let alone, who are submissive, who feel, we have to wait through the bad times and sooner or later it may improve. So judges are, have displayed different attitudes, and there are different strategies that populists use toward judges depending on their attitudes. Perhaps the attitude is the most, of all the populists, the most aggressive and brutal in Poland, because on the other side, we see a very high degree of spectacular resistance by judges there. We could see in Brazil, Bolsonaro picked up his personal enemy, Judge Roberto Barroso, who was previously in the Supreme Court and now is Chief Justice of the Electoral Court, whom he simply would insult regularly in media, because Barroso would criticize Bolsonaro's declarations, for example, about possibility of canceling the next elections, etc. So there is always the two-way street, and the actions of populist governments are to some extent a response to the reactions by judges.
If I can ask, if we can bracket for a second the pandemic and come back to it when we have time, but just in case we don't have time, there's a fundamental question in which I know Adam has a lot of interest, which is what is to be done, Lenin's question. And you entitle the chapter that you have on that, Antidotes, Remedies, and Miracles. If you could say a word about why miracles, since we don't meet them every day, and then I'll ask Adam if he would ask or actually challenge your account of what is to be done, since he has some challenges.
Well, the last chapter is about, sort of the question of Lenin and Charnota, what is to be done, what are the ways out, and trying to paint the prospects. And I put miracles into it because I immediately in the opening phrases of this chapter refer to your friend Martin and my friend and friend of many people around here, Stephen Holmes of NYU, currently of NYU Law School, who in one of the essays, actually an essay edited by Kasamstin, Can It Happen Here? That is whether all these nasty things which we talk about populism can happen in the United States. And many authors begin by saying, yes, it has actually happened here. Talks about Poland and Hungary and says that after all these changes that they've done, especially to public discourse, to freedom of the press, to mobilizing people against immigrants, and etc., probably only miracle may prevent further trajectory and slide towards open authoritarianism. Of course, Stephen is sort of provocative in this sentence, and I pick up on it and say, no, it probably won't take miracle, but it will take a very hard work. And in the end, what I'm saying is an extremely simplistic. I say what we have to do is to win the election against populists. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. And we saw even in recent years, Prime Minister Janša of Slovenia has lost, something that our friend Bojan Bogaric, who is present here, can confirm. Borisov, Prime Minister Borisov in Bulgaria has lost. The populist coalition in Italy of Cinque Stelle and Liga has lost and gave way to very non-populist government of Mario Renzi, who unfortunately has now lost to Giorgia Meloni. Netanyahu has lost. Of course, Trump has lost, etc. So it's not the case that populists will rule forever. Some of them move very quickly towards the situation in which victory against them is almost impossible. Hungary would be a bad example of that. And then they come to cross the line between populism and pure authoritarianism without this populist sort of adjective, as is the case in Russia, Belarus, or Turkey, which are just repressive regimes where elections are sham. But we can win with populists. Also, Babiš has lost. Also, in Slovakia, the presidential candidate has lost. In many capital cities governed by authoritarians, liberal Democrats has lost, whether it's Istanbul, Budapest, or Warsaw. So we can win, but it takes a lot. And winning the elections is just a proxy for something very, very complex, which includes also grassroots mobilization, media, NGOs, and last but not least, external support for Democrats, as in the case of EU's policing of democracy and the rule of law in member states.
Adam, do you want to chime in here?
So, yeah. Let me make a first confession. I'm not sure if I want to be associated with Lenin, but you did it, Wojtek. Anyway, my confession means that when I read your book, you converted me. It means I was much softer towards the populists, especially in Poland. Now my position is basically the same as your, or close to your position. But
the audience may not realize what a significant step this is. This is like converting the Antichrist.
That's right. But in this last chapter, when you develop these strategies, what to do to win election, basically they rely on the two, it seems to me, two issues. First is a huge turnover, electoral turnover, which is, I totally agree.
Turnout.
But then the second, unify opposition. It means unify opposition, which I am not fully convinced in the pluralistic society. You mentioned here in your talk that the values of the institutions disappear. Everything is being changed. And then you want to bring these values. How to bring these values? By the unify only opposition. How many people within the electorate would be simply don't turn up to the election because precisely they don't have any option to whom to vote for. So it's the first. Then the second issue, which I am not fully convinced, is the role of the international institutions. Especially in case of Europe, is the role of EU, right? It means it's sort of the monitoring and not only monitoring, but implementing some policies towards the populist government in power. Well, EU institutions are far away from the citizens. Therefore, it seems to me it could simply build up some sort of the resentment towards these institutions, not to encourage to win an election or to, let's say, go back on the main track. And last but not least, it seems to me that when you wrote about this war on institutions, I expected in the end of the book, sort of the blueprint, maybe not, but to show the direction of the radical institutional changes. But when I finished reading the book, my feeling was that basically what you defend is the status quo ante. It means that let's go back to how it used to be before the populists took power.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so of course, unified opposition, there is a certain paradox in the unified opposition remedy. On the one hand, I've read a number of political science, sort of hard political scientist theorists in the literature on democracy. And who am I to challenge them? Which say that the unified opposition is the single most important factor in the victory of Democrats in hybrid regimes, full stop. So they are, and there are there is plenty of empirical evidence for that. And the number crunchers suggest of all the possible factors, including the turnout and many others, this is the most important one. And I suppose Israel provides almost an extreme example of it, where you had the most unlikely of all possible oppositions, where almost everyone who disliked Netanyahu joined the opposition and they won. Okay. But at the same time, the problem is that the more ecumenical an opposition is, the thinner programmatically it becomes. And then the question is, would people have sufficient motives, electors that is, would voters have sufficient motivations to go out and vote for the opposition, which stands we don't know what for? And that's a big dilemma. Now, I personally believe that negative program, say anti-Netanyahu, anti-Orban, anti-Kaczynski, etc., in fact, can be re-articulated in very positive terms, what we stand for and why we don't like all these guys. But again, the jury is still out. We had some examples of very unified opposition winning in difficult circumstances, Netanyahu, and we've had examples of very unified, very broad opposition losing, as in Hungary. You know, to some extent, of course, the Hungarian system has been so deformed that as our friend Kim Lane-Sheppel has said, even if the opposition wins, it loses. Okay. The question of the impact of international, international public opinion, which is a nice concept. But we talk, of course, mainly about the European Union because there's no other supranational organization which will have similar type of powers of policing things such as democracy and the rule of law in their member states. The UN does not, ASEAN does not, etc. But the EU does. I disagree with the statement that the EU is far away from citizens. I don't like this sort of metaphors. Who is far away? I mean, is a local government which is populist and insensitive to its people closer to it? I mean, people may relate better to people, I don't know, persons like Vera Jourova, who is far away in Brussels, than in their town when they believe that a mayor runs wrong policy. So the distance is a sort of like metaphor, which I don't think is correct here. And in my view, yes, it is. You had sort of referred to a possible backlash type of argument. That is that the more the EU intervenes, to use the old and thoroughly discredited language in the internal affairs of its member states, the more backlash there will be against the EU. Well, the backlash is a very relative formula. And I had actually a debate with Vera Jourova at a State of the Union event in Florence this year. And the thing I said, well, don't worry about this backlash thing. Because yes, some people will be angry about your intervention, but some people will be angry about your non-intervention. I think people who think like me and my friends in Poland would be very upset about the EU, which decides not to intervene, for example, with financial sanctions vis-a-vis Polish government. So, you know, it's always a matter of comparison. And sorry, what was the last point that you made, Adam, the third one? Because I haven't noted. No, you have to unmute yourself.
That what you propose basically is a status quo ante, not a radical institutional change.
Yeah. Yeah, I plead guilty. I plead guilty. Yeah, status quo ante. Status quo ante in Hungary before Orban wasn't all that bad. And in Poland before Kaczynski, that is up to mid-2015, was not all that bad. And so on and so on. These were all imperfect regimes, but imperfect regimes within democracy. My power of imagination is extremely limited. And I do not have this imagination of thinking about alternative formulas for democracy. My good friend and ex-doctoral student, but now friend Eric Gosch, who is present here, has written wonderful things about citizens' juries, for example. And obviously we can think along these lines. And I'm the last one who would in any way disparage or criticize it. But I think first things first, let's go back to the good old formulas of tripartite division of power, judicial independence, etc. And then, let's think about experimentation. But we cannot start thinking about experimentation in the middle of chaos and dismantlement of democracy.
Can I ask a couple of interrelated autobiographical questions? In a very well-received book, and the second edition came out, Rights Before Courts, about constitutional courts in Eastern Europe, which all sprang up, which were developed after the collapse of communism. You were very not so critical of giving too much power to such courts. And in recent years, you have been one of the major defenders of the courts that are there, which had those powers. So I wonder whether you see whether you could give us a reason. Is there a change of views, or is it just a change of circumstances? And secondly, related to that, in a book we co-edited, you had an ironic chapter or an ironic title which compared simplistic to fancy theories of constitutional change in democratic transitions. And the ironic part was that you were a defender of simplistic theories, the ones which said, look, let's just put in the right democratic and liberal institutions and let them run. Don't go into all this fancy stuff that people like Greg go into, where say, look, this is a social, political, other experiment which relies on many other things than these forms, and these forms may not be able to withstand other pressures. I'm just interested, since you had those views and I don't believe you've given up on them, how they look to you now.
Okay, so the first point, Martin, are you accusing me of hypocrisy? Because if you do, then I'm going to cancel our social event tomorrow. We are supposed to go out together and have a dinner, but I'm not going to take those accusations of hypocrisy from you. Okay, seriously. Yes, I have, there has been a change in my thinking about, well, not so much in my thinking, in my writing about constitutional courts, between the stage when I looked at constitutional courts in post-communist states at an early stages of building democracy, when I was relatively critical of those courts for all sorts of reasons. I believe that it would be better if we had adopted a more US style of dispersed judicial review, where every single judge within the limits of her jurisdiction can declare a law unconstitutional, rather than having this very elitist aristocratic group of 7, 15 or 19 judges who can undo the statutes. I believe that at an early stage of building democracy, it is somehow not good for constitutionalists. I may have been right, I may have been wrong, but it's not me who changed, it's the world that changed. And I believe, and actually I have a piece on this, about constitutional courts in the normal times and in abnormal times. That's the title of one of my chapters in the book, which will appear in Poland soon, which you had mentioned, Demokracja na czarną godzinę. And I believe that in normal times, constitutional courts are very, of the sort of so-called Kelsenian nature, which have incredibly strong power of striking down democratically adopted laws as unconstitutional, are questionable in many, many ways. But that's in normal times. But then there come abnormal times in which the assault by the government, by the determined authoritarians in the populist government is so high that I have to be on the side of the victim, and the constitutional courts are victims. Constitutional Court of Rzepliński was a victim, and of course, Constitutional Court of Magister Przyłębska is not. This is Poles will recognize those sort of symbolic names. So in the abnormal times, I believe that my democratic creed forces me, and sorry about sounding a bit too pompous, it forces me to be on the side of those institutions who fight for their existence, not for their self-empowerment, for self-aggrandizement, but for their existence. And I think that when I go back to my early, maybe somehow naive ideas that this dispersed constitutional review of the sort that exists in the United States or Japan or the Philippines or India, etc., is better, has been paradoxically or ironically vindicated, because it just shows that it's very easy to capture a body of 15 people. You simply wait, for the natural attrition and appoint your own judges, and that's it, rather than capturing 10,000 judges. And there are 10,000 so-called regular judges in Poland. You cannot control them this easily. So the structure lend itself to that type of capture. Now, for the distinction between simplistic and fancy theories, I don't know whether there are many people who would be interested in it. It was just it was many years ago when many of us, including Adam, Martin, and me, wrote about transitional constitutionalism, and there was the whole sort of focus on transition. And it was my, and an essay to which Martin refers, which probably had not been read by so many people, especially in this group, was a protest against applying to post-communist countries from Central and Eastern Europe different standards of democracy. And there were some people, many of them our friends, who said, look, I mean, we do not need in Eastern Central Europe to have our traditional views of democracy. Sometimes courts themselves may be the best democratic agents. And I sort of, because of the special conditions there, and I call these ideas fancy ideas. And I think, no, let's have a simplistic idea. Let's not, because I found that there is something very patronizing in this idea that post-communist states should be exempt from the regular standards of democracy, which are taken for granted in Western states.
Thank you. We have half an hour left. We have a question burning about pandemics. I hope we can, because that's an important chapter in the book, it's a specific, in a sense, application or circumstance which all regimes have had to face in the last several years. And you have some interesting things to say about that. I hope we can squeeze it into the discussion, but I think it's time that we should open, at least to start with, the discussion to the audience. And so I'd solicit questions. I can see one from Rosalind Dixon, but Carolyn, do you have an order of business? You're muted.
So I do that just to make everybody else feel better. Perhaps take Rose's question first, and then we'll see if any in the audience would like to type one into the chat box or put your hand up to speak.
Okay, so Rose asks me about Giorgia Meloni. And Rose, of course, I think the worst of her, and I'm very worried about her electoral victory. My worry is somewhat moderated by a number of factors. First of all, as far as I can see, she will have to govern with a coalition. And that makes her qualitatively different from the predicament of people like Orban, Kaczynski, or Bolsonaro, now out of office, but until recently, who more or less enjoyed unlimited power, didn't have to negotiate their powers with the coalition partners. But I don't know much about it. I see Jacques Ziller, my friend who lives in Italy, who perhaps could say more about that. Also, there are many people who also there is a condition, of course, of the president of Italy, president who, although institutionally enjoys relatively narrow powers, nevertheless not as narrow as, say, president in Hungary. And we could see in the previous government crisis in Italy that President Mattarella played a very positive and important and active role. And I'm sure that she will have to respect and take account of his position, because he's a very hugely legitimate, respected leader. So there are many people, you know, like Timothy Garton Ash, who say, look, don't keep calling her neo-fascist. Of course, she has this neo-fascist sort of ideology, but she will not be a neo-fascist in the government. I have no idea. But in my view, you know, it may sound strange, but Italian institutions are reasonably stable. and they impose relatively strong constraints upon whoever come to power. And these constraints do not come only from Corte Costituzionale or from other official institutions. They also come from the institutions somewhat less constitutional, such as Catholic Church or mafia, but they impose very strong restraints on whoever is in power. And it may be a good thing too. But this is a very this is an idea of an ignoramus, someone who loves Italy but doesn't know it all that well.
Thanks, Wojciech. I am just going to go to Bojan Bogaric, bring him onto the screen.
To whom, sorry?
Bojan.
To Bojan. He should be popping up any second. Bojan, if you can turn on your video and unmute.
Sorry, who are we talking about?
Hey, here we go.
Bojan, that's Bojan, our good old friend Bojan.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't use the chat function is disabled, so that's why I raised my hand. So just two things. So first, I would like to congratulate Wojciech for this fantastic book. I see one big important thing which distinguishes the book from many others. I'm not talking only about books in legal field about populism, which I think makes it currently probably one of the most important books, which is, and that Wojciech tells us in the beginning himself, he's not talking about what populists say, about their platforms, about their promises, but he's looking at what they actually do. So it's a very socio-legal book, and by that it unveils, it shows the complexity of these different populists. So it's an excellent, enjoyable read, and also much more realistic account of populism. So, for example, just my kind of own trouble with the earlier literature, that it kind of created this straw man, which was so easily to attack. I mean, by Nadia Urbinati and Jan Werner Müller. The books have many qualities, but the picture of populism was for me just too much of a straw man. So that's a compliment. And second, a question. I find your concluding chapter also really sort of an interesting development, because you seem to me very critical about this kind of mainstream approaches, which mostly think about how to punish populists, punitive approach. Let's call it punitive approach. Let's use Article 7. Let's withhold financial, contributions, and so on and so on. And you suggest something else, quoting Gene Cohen, and saying basically that we have to look at those anxieties. We have to figure out why so many people are voting for populism. And then here you remain a little bit more enigmatic, because in your speech also you mentioned you don't have this vision, these alternative programs, but you acknowledge that they are important, they are crucial. So in order to defeat the populists, we have to, find better programs that responds to the anxieties of these people. And here I would like to link my question to Adam's point. I was a little bit perplexed when you said in response to him that basically, you pleaded guilty. You said, yes, I'm for status quo. I'm not so sure. I think the populism, not always, but in many ways, is just, a response to the, crisis of liberalism. And you yourself say that liberalism is a very rich thing. It can offer many different things. So you don't have to go outside of liberalism to respond. But I wouldn't say that, if you mean by status quo only restoring, separation of powers, independence, of course, I'm also for that. But if we talk about other broader social political issues, I think we need much more than status quo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bojan. And let me just say, not as a mere reciprocity for your very kind congratulations, but let me say that your work on populism has had tremendous impact on me, and I would like to recommend to everyone a terrific recent book by Bojan Bogaric and Mark Tashnet, Power to the People. Read the covered books, which you can see behind Bojan's head, are copies of that book, probably. It's a terrific book. And the way in which Bojan affected my thinking about populism is that what I tried initially to do is to somehow emphasize what political scientists call the supply side of political system as opposed to demand side. That is, I thought that there is so much thinking about the demand, that is, what are societal anxieties, problems, and conflicts which generate certain ideals, that we stop thinking about, wait a moment, but there are two sides to it. The other side of the medal is supply side. I mean, at a certain point, there must be someone like, I don't know, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, or Viktor Orban, who provide people with very well-crafted, fancy, and very simplistic ideas about how to meet their demands. But I think that as I was writing, and by the late stage of my writing, I've read Bugarich-Tushnet book, I realized that, you can't go too far in that emphasis on supply, and you have to pay much more attention to demand. And that is something that I am indebted to you, Bojan. Now, of course, when I said to Adam that I'm in favor of status quo, it was a little bit of this game that I have had with Adam over the past 60 years or so. I mean, we make this sort of fun of ourselves. And I sort of provoke him, that we should go back to the status quo ante, because he is very critical, much more critical of that status quo ante than I am. But in a sense, it is a very country-specific issue. Status quo ante in Hungary, when the incumbent, before Orban came to power, in this famous speech said, we lied in the morning, in the afternoon, and the evening, was different than status quo ante in Poland under Tusk. And again, I don't want to idealize anything, but I believe that just to say, yeah, you want to go back to the status quo ante, that sounds so very, very, I don't know, naive and thin. But I think we have to start from certain basic principles and see whether those basic principles have been better met before than they are now. And I have some ideas about the ways in which democracy in countries such as Poland may be improved. I believe in different ideas of, for example, judicial review, election of constitutional courts, etc. But I think by and large, the Constitution provides a relatively sound template for democracy, except that it hasn't been complied with. So if someone looks for a vision thing, they will not find it in my book.
Though you do well, maybe not uncharacteristically, but you do emphasize certain weaknesses in liberalism that you think liberals need to repair, attention to community identity, patriotism, and faith. And that's, in a sense, a direction. It's not an endpoint, but it's a direction where one gets the sense this is where you think they have to reconsider or more deeply consider.
Yeah, sure. So that is, but this is a very underdeveloped chapter, or very underdeveloped last thoughts in the book, which I hope I will be able to develop in future. I mean, we, liberal Democrats, in a very broad sense of the word, we are guilty of a number of sins, and the deficits of liberal democratic thought are pretty obvious. I mean, the fundamental issue, and I think that will resonate, Bojan, with you, is that we should respect the voters of populists. We shouldn't respect populists themselves, but we should respect those who voted for them, often out of despair, desperation, pessimism, anger, etc. And we should address all these things, but in a way which is not exclusionary, not hate-based, like against, immigrants, refugees, etc., not anti-religious, not anti-patriotic, not anti-community, not anti-identity. We do have to take up those causes seriously and inject egalitarian thinking on it. And I think that liberalism, philosophy of liberalism, has plenty of resources for that. So I mentioned, for instance, an idea of public reason, which for me rolls an idea of public reason, which is the most egalitarian of all possible views. And I spent several hundreds of pages in my new book, which is about to appear, precisely on that. I think that a lot of thinking of liberals such as Dworkin and Waldron and others have this communitarian and egalitarian potential, and we should not allow, so to speak, populists to monopolize those values. We shouldn't sort of succumb to the caricature of liberalism being about atomistic, self-serving, egoistic individualism.
Carolyn, there's quite a list of questions.
Yes, Martin, there is. There's great questions. So would you like to take the next one in the Q&A box?
But I can't, sorry, I haven't read it because I can't split my attention. So yeah. I can see Rosalind Dixon saying I'm back, which is...
Yep, and the next one below that.
Oh, by Marek Spolak. Wojtek, do you
Yes.
think that populism is signum temporis of our times, or is rather permanent period when the democracy is weak? Thank you, Marek. I think that it is more the former than the latter. I do not think that when democracy is weak, it necessarily produces opportunities for populist authoritarianism or authoritarian populism in the way I understand it. More often than not, it gave rise to movements such as Leninism or fascism or various post-colonial types of despotic governments like in Cuba. None of them can be properly described as populism. I think authoritarian populism, that is the government which emerges from free and fair election and which uses both socioeconomic and institutional and ideological devices of a sort of paranoia and conspiracy theories in order to maintain popularity, is unfortunately something which is what you call signum temporis.
Can I suggest that I'll read, and Wojciech, you can read along as I read them out, 3 more questions, and you can briefly answer them just so that we can try to do justice to the number of questions that we have.
Thank you, Martin. Can you just give me a second, because it's we are in Sydney, it's getting dark, so I'll just have to turn my lights on in my office. So just a second. Okay, this is...
Okay, so the first question from Onur Uçarya. I wanted to ask what your main criterion between the completely authoritarian Russia, Belarus, and populist governments, Hungary, Poland, whether it is the lack of competitive elections. If so, why do you think Turkey is in the Russia-Belarus league now, keeping in mind the recent local elections, which the government lost in big cities such as Istanbul?
Yeah, look,
there is a bit of praise. So let me just ask the next 2. I'm not sure from Agnieszka Bien-Katsala what the first question is, because we get to the second question, well, which I'll get to then, hoping that she can inform us about the first, concerns the way of reverting or reversing changes within the Polish Constitutional Tribunal. How can you proceed with all the judges that are in office? The termination of their term of office could be similar to be what was done between 2015 and 2016.
Yeah.
Of course, you've written on that in Poland. The third question from Meir Yarob. You mentioned the institutional aspect of the problem, and I'd like to ask, what do you think about the more cultural or ideological component of populists' attacks on elitist institutions, namely the undermining of the idea of professional bureaucracy itself? Does it strike you as a notable ingredient in the populist move to consolidate power? And I have to add because it's there. Thanks for a wonderful discussion.
Okay, thank you so much. So Onur, let me first say just a word on Turkey. And indeed, Turkey is not part of my list of exemplars of populist authoritarianism. And I should perhaps throw in an extra definitional ingredient here, which hadn't been present in the discussion so far. And that is that I'm thinking about populist authoritarianism, especially in the situations of anti-democratic backsliding. That is, I'm not interested in the countries which are sort of in, as some people call it, a plateau, where really true democracy has not settled in yet. And again, little that I know about Turkey, it seems to me that before Erdogan came to power, the strength of the control by the military over the political system of Turkey meant that no one could really describe it as a card-carrying member of democratic community. Okay, they had been in Council of Europe and signatory to the European Convention of Human Rights for many, many years, but I think it was mainly for strategic reasons. So I'm really interested in those countries which had already achieved a relatively high degree of democratic standards, and all the countries which I describe which I use in my book belong to that. And then there was this sharp decline. I think this sharp decline creates some very interesting and important problems. I mean, people still remember about what it was like being more democratic or having judges being more independent and things like that. So, this this backsliding aspect, the dimension of trajectory is an important part for my thinking about populist authoritarianism, which I had not had an opportunity to talk about here, but which sort of puts Turkey in a separate category. I do not want to disparage Turkey by putting it in the camp together with Belarus and Russia, but that's the reason why I did. Now, to Meir, because the most difficult challenge will come from Agnieszka. So to Meir now. Thank you, Meir. And by the way, Meir is in a short time will be our visiting fellow here at University of Sydney, and I'm very, very happy that you'll become our colleague. Yeah, of course, populists fight against what you call professional bureaucracy. Professional bureaucracy provides certain set of stable values with which populists cannot coexist. And therefore, to use a cliche, it is not a coincidence that one of the first legislative changes of the Law and Justice when it came to power in Poland in 2015 was to completely dismantle the structure of civil service and dismantle everything that made civil service an independent and autonomous force, including the requirement that you cannot join certain top echelons of civil service if you are a member of a party, and there were certain temporal requirements of that, and many other guarantees of a relative apolitical and professional character of bureaucracy. But for them, Orban put it very nicely. He said, it's not institutions which take decisions, people take decisions. And therefore we have to make sure that there are right persons. And there's the whole philosophy of populists, also of Kaczynski, for whom the most important thing is not so much what are institutional competencies and procedures, etc., but who is there. And that is, of course, anathema to professional bureaucracy. To Professor Bienkacała, question about the Constitutional Tribunal, maybe many people will not know about it, but let me just refer to the only English language version of my proposal, which is in Verfassungsblog. So we have this problem in Poland, if, which is a huge if, but hope dies last. So if in 2023, Democratic Coalition wins in Poland, they will have these problems, they will have those constraints. On the one hand, president. The president will still have one more year in power because he has independent electoral legitimacy. But there will be also Constitutional Tribunal. And the Constitutional Tribunal, you have the majority of people which are put there, elected there by Law and Justice. And I sort of counted their terms of office. And the majority of Law and Justice judges will be there at least until early 2026, which basically means that if they stay there and if they maintain their current outlook, which I think they will, because why would they lose the support of their patrons, means that in the system of very strong powers of Constitutional Court in Poland, they will be able to invalidate any legislative changes that the new coalition will have. And for me, it's not just immoral, it's also illegal that you may use the abuses of Constitution against the Constitution itself. And therefore, I suggested, in my proposal, which I put forward in some articles in Poland, is that, in my view, this Constitutional Tribunal, as it is now, is not just illegal because I don't like their judgments. That's the case everywhere. Many people don't like today's judgment of the Supreme Court of the United States, but they don't say it's illegitimate. But in Poland, it's illegitimate because there are some members of it who had been obviously and self-evidently improperly put there, and their presence contaminates the entire composition and procedures of the court. That's why I think that if the new coalition comes to power, it should begin the existence of Constitutional Tribunal from ground zero. But at the same time, I thought that we should adopt in Poland the dispersed judicial review, which is part of my interview I gave to Okopres, where I put forward in Poland this idea, and that there are sufficient constitutional grounds for it, so it just takes some legislative changes. Now, I'm not proud and happy about making this proposal, but there is something in me that fundamentally protests an idea that the restoration of democracy may be fully disabled by all those people who were elected into after all, very small body of 15, often through various dirty tricks.
We have two more questions, and I'd like to, if Wojciech, they're both important questions, if you could answer them but briefly, and that will be the end, I think. We'll have to wind up after that. The first by Jacques Diller is, what about the role of social media in the victory of Trump, Bolsonaro, maybe others? And the second by Tiernis Rue, could you say a little more about India, which features as a case study in the book, but which hasn't been mentioned so far? He's particularly interested in the extent to which a justified leftist discourse of anti-imperialism gets taken up in India in the cause of right-wing religious nationalism. To what extent is anti-Westernism, as opposed to anti-liberalism, if the two can be distinguished, driving contemporary populism?
Yeah, thank you very much. So first of all, to Jacques, obviously, social media has been a favorite device used by populists. That's the case absolutely everywhere, but in particular in countries such as Brazil, India, and the Philippines. Perhaps slightly to a less extent in countries such as Hungary or Poland, where I think the balance of influence on social media, Twitter, Facebook, etc., had been more or less balanced or equalized between the liberal Democrats and populists, more or less. I mean, there is something intrinsic to social media that they favor simplistic, often conspiratorial, often exaggerated views. You know, if you have 280 characters to make your point, you don't go into a complex analysis of the sort that you would find in Professor Krieger's essays. You know, you rather get a Sadursky type of in-your-face statement, and obviously populists prefer that type of discourse. To Tunis. So the one takeaway from the popularity of Modi, which I got, was slightly less this anti-Western rhetoric, which I take it is very strong there. And therefore it may appear to us more of a left-wing character than his anti-Muslim rhetoric, which I think is very, very strong. Anti-Muslim, anti-federalist, you know, with Kashmir's independence being more or less eroded, with his inhuman treatment of immigrant workers and all that stuff. So I can't say that I can display a very rich knowledge of India. I relied here on my remarkable research assistant Pooja Khatri, who is of Indian origin. But my view is that those themes which fit my template of populist rhetoric, sort of conspiracy theories. I mean, Modi had invented, and his BJP party picked it up, you know, an idea of love jihad. That is that Muslims have this idea of seducing as many Indian young women as possible in order to increase Muslim population in India. These sort of things, you know, that there is more of this type of religious bigotry than of anti-Western rhetoric. But I'm sure it is there too. I just haven't looked at it maybe close enough.
Well, there we are.
Thank you, Tianis.
I said at the beginning that this was an enticing read. Those of you who haven't read it have now got plenty of reason to believe me. I think it was a wonderful discussion. I'm grateful to all the usual suspects, Carolyn, Adam, Wojciech, particularly grateful to Paula to participate, and to all of the participants. Remember that, like all the other webinars we've done, including our interview with Mark Tashnett and Bojan Bugric, these are archived and you can consult them when you would like. Remember too, please, that our next webinar is on the 23rd of November in Australia at 8 a.m., but somebody has to be awake at that time. In Europe at 11, in Britain at 10, in America, well, it's a big place, you will have to work it out for yourself. I do hope that you've enjoyed this as much as I have. I don't always enjoy thinking how to fill an hour and a half, but this was easy stuff and fascinating stuff, and I'm grateful particularly to Wojciech for that.
Thank you.
So
thank you very much to everybody. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good night and good luck. Thank you.